Hello, good afternoon friends. This is the CEC Gurukul lecture series, and we are running a new series of lectures starting in the last two occasions, and this series is called Romantic Trend in English Writing. And for this we have already delivered two introductory lectures. One was about what romantic trend was, how it could be defined. The second one was regarding the background of the 18th century that worked, towards the emergence of this trend. And today is the third lecture, and this third lecture is on French Revolution. This was mentioned in the first introductory lecture, but today we will have a detailed view of this. And for this we have the expert Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English literature in Hindu College, Delhi University. And she has written articles and she has published books, and she has also chaired sessions in national and international conferences. So, before I request Dr. Richa Bajaj to begin the proceedings, let me tell you friends that we are available in the last 20 minutes of this lecture. This starts at 2:30 and this goes up to 3:30, but let's say at 3:10 we have time for the viewers to ask questions, to make queries, to give observations, so that a kind of discussion and interaction begins. So in the last 20 minutes, we can entertain those questions and give ourselves a chance to have a share in the discussion that will follow. The toll-free number for contacting us at that time in the last 20 minutes is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. And then I come back to Dr. Richa Bajaj. Welcome. And Dr. Richa Bajaj, tell us about what you think of the romantic trend, the word romantic, and its connection with the happenings in Europe, particularly in France, because your topic of discussion today is the French Revolution. So just give us a general idea about your understanding of what romantic stands for, and then you can connect it with the French Revolution.
Today actually I thought I will begin with and talk about the French Revolution as a historical movement that took place at a particular time, and not so much connect with the romantic poets particularly, or even the romantic trend, because because when we reach and when we deal with individual poets at that time, perhaps we can take up this question of how the French Revolution impacted them separately and in their specific ways, because there is no one particular way in which French Revolution was understood and seen as an ideal by romantic poets. Each poet looked at the phenomena from their specific viewpoint and also found something for oneself there. So I don't think it will be correct to actually give a generalized view of romantic poets vis-a-vis French Revolution. We can discuss that as well, but to begin with, I'd like to talk about the French Revolution, and also what is that moment in history when the revolution in France takes place, how it takes place, in the sense what are the causes, and what are the trends that actually influence the French Revolution. So rather than seeing today as French Revolution as an influence on the romantics, I want to see today what has influenced and given rise to the French Revolution itself.
That's a correct perspective, yes.
And I'd like to begin with that, and time permitting we can also connect it to the romantic poets towards the end of the lecture. So when we speak of the French Revolution, then let me just give a brief overview as to when it begins. So French Revolution in 1789 is seen as the date. Most scholars of French Revolution believe that this is, one can actually pin it down to 1789, when ordinary people, the poor in France, were so frustrated with their conditions that they actually stormed the fortress of Bastille to take control of gunpowder and weapons, so they could, fight back the feudal lords. They could fight back this entire corrupt regime that they were fed up with. So people not only did they storm the Bastille and procured weapons from there, they looted the homes of tax collectors, landlords, the rich in general, the elite. So this period sees there's a kind of a rupture, and a kind of a rupture that takes place in society in France. I'm talking about the moment in brief, but what I'll actually do is to talk about the pre-1789 period as well, and talk about the old regime, the ancient regime as we call it, what actually was going on there, and how 1789 came into being, and later on take perhaps from there. So just to give you a brief overview of this, so in 1789 the abolition of the feudal order was finally passed, because the bourgeoisie in France was looking for this moment when and this moment was provided by the ordinary people in the country who stormed these houses, these chateaux, and took control of them, looted everything, and that is the level at which this kind of frustration or this kind of desperate measures that were being taken. So finally in 1789 the abolition of the feudal order was signed, and declaration of the rights of man and citizen were passed and laid down. 1791 you actually see France having its first written constitution, which was adopted, and here in 1791 you see that there is still a moderate stance taken vis-a-vis the king. The king still was given some veto power, some official kind of a stature was still given to them, but this did not go well with the radicals in France, and they pushed for a movement to turn things around, and they wanted the king to be ousted or beheaded. And so 1792 onwards actually you see that the movement turns more radical, and this is also the time when Prussia, when France has wars with Prussia and Austria, because they believed that a counter-revolutionary force was being sent to France which would favor the aristocracy and the noble lords, and they wanted to control that, because already now at this time by 1792 the state of affairs, at the helm of affairs is the bourgeoisie, at the helm of affairs is the National Assembly as they call themselves, and so they wanted to keep control of what had come to them as they had taken over France, and Austria and Prussia was seen to be helping the counter-revolutionary forces within the country, and so France goes to wars with them. So this is a very period which is turmoil-ridden, where are the wars, there's also massacres that takes place during this period 1792 when large-scale killings take place, when people who are understood to be counter-revolutionaries within France, they are guillotined, and this is also the time when most of the noblemen are fleeing the country and running away, because they know that they'll be killed any day. So this is that radical phase in France's
you mean there
history.
Is there's center in France, but the revolution actually is happening at the European level. People run away from there, and from there they may start influencing the developments in France.
Yes, in the sense that the moment France has turned its its regime, the moment the old regime has given way because of its weakness, because the king is arrested, and it's a kind of a coup of the bourgeois regime. So at this stage the neighboring countries are involved in helping the older regime in re-establishing or getting back their power, and it is at this time that France has to go on wars with Prussia and Austria, as I said, to defend itself, to defend the new regime that is coming to the new bourgeoisie that is coming to the fore. So yes, the neighboring countries get involved in the process, but I wouldn't say the entire Europe in that sense, but they're trying to control the counter-revolutionary actions that are taking place. And so also at this stage, it turns very violent. The revolution also turns violent because there is a kind of there is no sympathy given to even, there's no liberal view taken or no moderate view taken of the king or the king's supporters at this time.
So
they're all murdered.
White.
It's black and white, or yes, yeah. So they're murdered or they are ousted from the country. So then so this is that phase, and it is also in 1792 then that abolition of monarchy takes place and the French Republic is established. So this is and in fact and in 1793 you actually see Louis XVI is condemned to death, and later his wife also in a matter of months is meets the same fate. So 1793 onwards then, or actually 1794 onwards, this reign of terror. So this particular phase from 1791 to 294 is considered the reign of terror in France, because this is the time when massacre happens at on a very large scale, and people have become ruthless and also are zealous in this particular episode. So post 1794 you see more moderate policies are adopted, because now it's as if the feudalism is decimated. It's as if the enemy has been won over and is defeated and is dead, especially after the death of Louis XVI, when the monarch is dead. So who had the divine right, now he's dead, and by 1794 it is believed that this is the period when when democracy would be established, and at the same time the federal nature of France would also be established. So there is or this kind of republic that France would become. This is the moment of establishing and stabilizing itself.
What is a republic, by the way? Because I understand by republic something that is run in the name of the people.
Yes, it is a democracy in that sense.
Yes.
Yes. So you see, it's a republic is of course another name I would think for democracy and for the rights of people, as the constitution at that time says, declaration of the rights of man and citizen. So where you are looking at society, and when you look at republic, then one is obviously one thinks of Plato as well.
Yes.
One has in mind Plato when one thinks of the term republicanism or republic, that it's a kind of society which is self-sufficient and also has preserves the rights of people.
And this word became quite popular in England 100 years before now.
Right.
Before that time.
Before that time. Yes. So, in fact, there are studies which suggest that how thinkers at the time were influenced or had the English model in mind when the revolution took place. Of course, nobody as such knew that the revolution would take place, but things had reached an extreme situation where they knew that they had to change. But how they'd change, what model France would adopt, obviously nobody knew, but they had an English model of republicanism in their minds, the French, of course.
Why did the people, want change in France? And what was their aim, if they had an aim, or was it an outburst, that was not aware of itself?
No, I'll actually come to that, because I plan to discuss that particular bit as well.
Please do so,
yes. So just finishing that, 1799 onwards, you see the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he stages a coup and establishes himself as the first consul of France in this period. And then the period of, after this, the Napoleonic era actually begins, and the period of revolution is complete by 1799 or so. So these 10 years are are considered this primarily the decade when France is going through this kind of rupture and tumult, as you can call it. So this is a brief overview that I wish to give about the French Revolution. Now, talking about the old regime, as to what really was the old regime or the ancient regime, and how did this come into being, the situation, as you say, what were people thinking, what were they going through, what was the actual problem. So, this for that, I just thought that we can have a brief view of the dynasty that began, the Bourbon dynasty, how it begins at the time. So the old regime actually begins with the rise of the Bourbon dynasty from the accession of Henry IV in 1589. And this is the period. So this is from where you can trace this kind of Bourbon dynasty coming into being, and how feudalism is consolidated in this period, how absolutism gets consolidated. So this kind of royal absolutism, which is obviously which saw its heyday in the time of Louis XIV. So this is basically Henry IV ruled from 1589 onwards and till 1610, and here is when France is a feudal country and is completely feudal in its nature. But not that there were no traders, or they were the new emerging class. You could see them in factions, could see in groups around the place, but largely it was a feudalistic society. But after Henry IV, you have a brief period of the Queen Regent who takes over. 1624, you have Louis XIII who becomes the ruler. 1624, Louis XIII comes to the throne, followed by Louis XIV, and this is that glorious reign of France of Louis XIV from 1643 to 1715. Now, this is the period when which sees the triumph of royal absolutism, as I was calling it. So which means that the king is the absolute head of the country, and this was also the time when Louis XIV, actually it was the first time that he became his own prime minister. Till then they always had some cardinal figure who would advise them on the nature of states or on things of politics and state. But here you had Louis XIV who became his own prime minister, which means he became his own prime minister, and also guided France in the direction of this kind of absolutism, and he believed in the divine sanction of the king as well. But he was largely liked by the industrious bourgeoisie, which was obviously still not a very strong, powerful unit, but still there, and they liked him because he was well informed and he was attentive to their problems, and even as he believed in, as I said, his own divine right. Later, of course, his religious policies and the wars that he got engaged in, it drained the treasury of the country, and people became disillusioned of him, and this is generally seen as the decline of the Bourbon dynasty from Louis XIV to Louis XV. So when Louis XV comes to the throne, then he has a very long reign. He's actually made king when he's 5 years old. Of course, there are others who are ruling in his name, but largely this long rule of Louis XV is seen as a very corrupt rule, and he was indifferent on the whole, and extravagant in his practices as well. So this is the kind of feudalism, this is the kind of the rise and decline of you can say the ancient regime, that it sees its consolidation at the time of Louis XIV, and beginning from, they're taking the lead from Henry IV, it goes till that, and then the decline that you see with Louis XV's reign. And Louis XVI, of course, is who takes over the the long reign, which ends. After that you have Louis XVI, who takes over from 1774 till 1789, and so he's the weakest of all, because he's inherited a country that is fraught with many problems. He ascends to throne at a time when France had reached a state of complete crisis, and it was a time when the peasantry was bitter with, in its grievances, and the bourgeois was growing and becoming more strong, also becoming very impatient with the restrictions that were being put on it. The privileged class was also uncomfortable with the growth of the bourgeois, and they were always in a state of clash, these two groups. So the government had squeezed the economy dry by putting various taxes on the peasantry particularly. It had made itself bankrupt, and there were financial extravagances as well, corruption of the court, there were administrative inefficiencies. Whatever policies were taken they toppled, and they did not benefit the people at large. Along with that, there was this growing public opinion against the government for the weaknesses and errors that it was making, and at the same time, nobody anymore had complete faith in this absolutist government that once that the people had.
Actually, the way I understand it from your very clear, enunciation of this is that there is a king. That king is supported by a court, which is entirely his court under his control. And this court, has tentacles all over the country. And economically speaking, this court and the king heading it, they are in a way financed by, if I can use that word in that sense, by the productive skills of the peasantry. And this court people, this people in the court and administrative machinery, as you call it, they have no interest in how peasants will work in their fields. They only have policies to tax them. And more taxes are imposed on the peasantry, and the court and the king, they are insensitive, and this insensitivity gives rise to a kind of economic crisis, and there's more poverty there. This is how I understand.
Yes, you see, what is happening, if one just understands the situation, is that the king, the monarchy, has no money left on itself. It has spent, because of its culture, its if I could call it a parasitical culture of the nobility.
That's the exact word, yes.
So, because of the culture, because they refuse to work. You see, also for the aristocrats, it was beneath them to work. So, when the bourgeois is growing, the feudalism or the nobility is also changing. The idea of nobility is also changing. Some noblemen actually take up some, such as the metallurgy or certain industries. They actually dabble with them as well. Some others don't. And meanwhile, what has happened is that the king is left with no money, and it needs support from those who have control, who have resources, who have wealth, and for that reason it has to turn to the bourgeoisie. And you see, it's a kind of a vicious cycle altogether.
There is a small section of the bourgeoisie. They are working, in order to produce things for the market. There is a kind of limited market as in the feudal times, and this market is not allowed to grow as much as possible.
Right. The market is not allowed to grow, and the king and yet this new class that is coming into being wants to push its limit and wants to gain more and more control. And so you see, then what happens is that the king starts to sell titles and begins to sell, as in England as well. It starts to sell nobility as such, and even offices. So with the selling of titles, anybody any commoner with money could become a nobleman. So in that sense, also. And then offices, administration was then abundant, had such people in great numbers who were the new rich. And in that sense, when they occupied these, so there were a group of noblesse lawyers who came from common backgrounds, and now they were able to make money, and so they became noblemen. And so there's a kind of a fluidity then of the nobility. The nobility is no more that in a way very rigid framework where one is not noble by birth alone. One can become noble by gaining or by buying a title.
Interestingly, this is exactly what Balzac shows in one of his novels, Old Goriot, for instance.
That's
that
true.
Old Goriot becomes rich, and after that, he starts even buying sons-in-law.
Right, exactly.
People
yes.
from the nobility.
So that is exactly what is happening, and it's a threat to aristocracy, and yet it is how things are developing. So the feudal order is necessarily crumbling under this new system, because there's no money with the treasurer or in the king's treasury. Therefore, they require money, and they have to turn to this new class, give give them space, and the more space they give them, the more places they occupy, and they become strong in the parliament then, and they become a powerful unit, that increasingly then the tentacles of this new class reach the parliament and finally the king. So how with money they've been able to buy positions, and with positions they've been able to get some power and wield and also mold things in their direction.
As I get it, I think the money is in the hands of the traders to a large extent, and the traders are now vying for control with the people in the court. And these two people, they come actually as a kind of obstacle for the peasantry, which is not given any attention at all.
That is true. And in fact, you know, if I could just also quote from one of the books, very interesting, and it says here, and this is by Gershaw, Leo Gershaw, and he writes in the book The French Revolution and Napoleon. He says that, I quote, "The new class of capitalists used their wealth to buy titles of nobility and government offices, while the monarchy relied upon them for its ever more needed loans. To repay those loans, the state resorted to increasing the tax rate upon the peasantry, while it perpetuated the fiscal exemption or privileges of those from whom alone it could borrow money," unquote. If we just understand this entire thing, what he is actually saying is, at another place he says, taxes fell unequally upon His Majesty's subjects. The privileged classes were for the most part exempt from taxation, and the peasantry bore the brunt. So exactly what is happening here.
This is a very killing and a very destructive kind of bourgeois development in feudalism, because the feudal lords, they don't have any money with themselves, so they as you rightly point out, they borrow from these people who are the merchants, and the merchants are not taxed also.
Right, exactly. So the point is that the capitalists are using their wealth to buy titles of nobility and government. They're also buying government offices. As I said, they become administrators, lawyers, judges. So they become all of that. They buy that. And then the monarchy is relying on them because it needs loans, and it needs loans from them, and it takes loans from the bourgeoisie or from the capitalists. Now it needs to repay those loans. The monarchy needs to repay those loans. How will it repay? By taxing the peasants. And when it taxes the peasants, then it exempts also the capitalists.
There is a kind of unholy tie-up between the French bourgeoisie and the court.
Right.
And
exactly.
The
so they need the money, they take the loan, but then they need to return the loan. How will they return the loan? So they tax the peasants, but they don't tax the capitalists in that sense. They in fact exempt them, because obviously they need to borrow money from them, so how can they tax them? So you see, it is this kind of a twisted logic that is that here Gershaw talks about.
It's a very degenerate feudalism.
Exactly. So and the peasants then really had to not only deal with these multiple taxes such as direct and indirect taxes that they had a salt tax and other taxes. Along with that, the tradition of the nobility is carried forward. The monarchical older tradition where of performing manorial duties is also carried forward. Manorial duties is a part of the feudal system where the peasant, the tenant, has to work, pay rent, or at least give some service to the landlord, and continues to do so. And he cannot even ever be free of the land. He cannot even buy his land. He can't even, if his child leaves him, then that the child has no right to that the place that he has taken. So all those laws have necessarily been working against the peasants through.
Which means that the wealth is being produced by the peasant, but this wealth is expropriated together by the king and his court and the bourgeoisie.
And the peasants are doubly oppressed in that sense. From on the one hand, they have the news because of the new growing class and all that churning that is taking place. They are being taxed, commercial tax, all kind of taxes, and still they are they're still in the clutches of the old monarchical system where they have to still perform the manorial duties. So they are in a way caught from at both ends. So in that sense, the peasantry had was the most frustrated frustrated at this particular time, and was actually had organized itself into this kind of a group. It was autonomously, it had its own crisis, it had its own tendencies, this entire peasant movement that took place at the time of the French Revolution. And it is their contribution actually that gave this kind of fillip, and made the revolution a success, in fact. But many people actually suggest that from the French Revolution actually went from the urban centers to the peasantry, and the peasantry were involved later. But studies have actually found that how the peasants, in a way, were the ones who were giving a push to this entire revolutionary activity on the whole.
The energy was of the peasantry, and that energy was destroying the feudal system, which constituted the court, and the bourgeoisie didn't know what to do, and they were not giving any push to the change. They were in fact all the time siding with the court. So this is how I understand, and which means there is a kind of stalemate, and something explosive is to happen in order to take things out of their control.
Yeah, and finally, there are these calamities that actually become the final push in the series of failures that take place around them. Their crops fail in 1788 and 1789, and there is extreme cold winter of 1788 and 1989, and this gives rise to their demand for more land, and also relief from these obligations that they have towards the nobility and the church, and also of the abolition of the manorial system, and equality of taxes was another demand that they raised. So suggesting that there's actually a book which came out, which for the first time by Lefebvre, Georges Lefebvre, he writes in this book on the French Revolution, and provides a kind of study of the peasantry, and demonstrates that the peasant movement developed autonomously, he says, and had its own origin, method, which was independent of the bourgeois.
This is precisely what you have established by saying, that other power centers, they are on one side, and peasantry without any power at all is on the other side. So peasantry has to explode. There's no other way it can assert itself.
Right. Yes.
And later on, this ancient regime, if it splits, then the bourgeoisie, as you call them, this bourgeoisie will be left in the lurch for some time. They will have to now adjust with the radicals which you used in the beginning.
Yes, in the sense that you see what so there is this particular this actually helps, because the goals of the peasantry and the goals of the bourgeois, they coincide, and in that sense, because they're both looking to oust or to overthrow an old system, that is the feudal order and the feudal system, and therefore their goals coincide, and there is a kind of uniformity, but otherwise it was not a homogeneous kind of activity, and certainly not that it transferred from, because generally when we think of French Revolution, then we look at it as a bourgeois revolution, guided and directed entirely by the bourgeois, while the peasantry played a very important and a major role in this movement. In fact, France was at that time primarily an agricultural country, and the most of the population stayed in the villages, and very few, a very small percentage stayed in the cities, and they were scarcely populated. Paris was hardly populated at that time. So, and in fact, when we talk of the new class and of these merchants, then this new class is actually only now coming to the fore. It's not like a group that is there. In fact, these are more like petty bourgeois at the time, who have some workmen are working, a few workmen are working under their industries. So it's not even an industry. They would have factories, just as perhaps as you mentioned, old Goriot in Balzac does. So that is certainly
he is making money just by producing vermicelli.
Right, exactly, and it's a small unit. It's not like he's an industrialist or something. So this is exactly what France was at that time then, with small industrial units or small factory units, where and different commerce taking place at different levels, whether there were chemical factories or there was these metals, which were these factories which were working on them. So the idea is that it was France was still primarily agricultural in nature. Also, very interestingly, in the field in church or in the field of religion, you notice that there is a lot of difference between the clergy who's closer to the monarchy and the country parish, or the clergy in the parish.
So there is a kind of divide there.
There is a divide there, and the parish clergies could not get the benefits and continued to ask for benefits and were treated with arrogance by the clergy heads.
Urban people.
So there is a kind of divide there, and therefore in 1789 these parish clergies actually joined the movement. So to say, that's why it's not like a bourgeois revolution. Many sections of societies who are reeling under this kind of deprivation and under this life of deprivation and of injustice is now fighting back, or is now rebelling against this kind of system.
I'm wondering that the French Revolution gets its thinkers from, if they have any thinkers, from the rural areas.
Yes, very interesting that you talk about thinkers, because it is a very interesting thing that happens in France, that most of the thinkers actually they're called the thinkers of Enlightenment.
Yes.
And they give this kind of what you can call a kind of discourse or a narrative to the disappointments of, or the disillusionments of the people, and materialize them, and also in a way, I think, authenticate that this exists. So it comes on the shoulders of these thinkers and reformers who actually speak out.
Have a basis in the village. And they are in touch with the village reality.
Not all of them. Somebody like Rousseau, who spent his time wandering.
Say something about Rousseau. That would be
yes. Yeah. So let me give you a brief background to what is happening in France, and then connect it with the Enlightenment thinkers, because this philosophism in France is an important attribute, an important element of what inspired, what brought the French Revolution finally in place. So Thomas Carlyle, in the book The French Revolution, a history, has observed, and I quote, "Remark how from amid the wrecks and dust of this universal decay, new powers are fashioning themselves, adapted to the new time and its destinies. Besides the old noblesse, there is a new recognized noblesse of lawyers, an unrecognized noblesse of commerce, powerful enough with the money in its pocket. Lastly, powerfulest of all, least recognized of all, a noblesse of literature.
I see.
Without steel on their thigh, without gold in their purse, but with that grand thaumaturgic faculty of thought in their head. French philosophism has arisen. Here indeed lies the cardinal symptom of the whole widespread malady. Faith is gone out, skepticism is come in." Unquote.
Which means that the ideas which were produced in the court and the centers of urban power, they were different from the ideas that emerged in the village, and the village people became finally the philosophers, and they were tied up in the philosophical kind of
no,
frame.
Villagers didn't turn philosophers. What Carlyle here is trying to suggest is that because nobility could be bought, so you had different breeds of nobility coming to the fore. There was the nobility of commerce that had money with it. There was the old nobility that was there, but the new nobility that has come, which nobody really pays attention to, is the nobility of literature. That means literature suddenly at this moment becomes important, and it is coming from different and it's not like it's a unified whole or a group of writers working together. They're all independent writers who are who in a way are elaborating the ideas of the villagers and the ordinary folk. So these are the people, these writers take up the cause of humanity, if we could call it. They could be called humanitarian, in fact, or humanists, if we talked about, so like the humanists of the Renaissance period. So these writers take up the task of targeting,
expressing and projecting the interests of the poor people in the
poor
village.
people, and also marking out the injustice that is meted out to them, and also attack the older system and make way for a new system to come in place, make way for democracy, make way for tolerance and humanism, and rationality based on the principle of rationality. So these become the new ideals, and that is why Carlyle says that this is the root cause of the malady with the French Revolution. Actually is it largely inspired by the Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire, such as Montesquieu, such as Rousseau. So these are the writers who did not have a particular aim in mind. They didn't want to bring a revolution, in fact. In some cases, Montesquieu and Voltaire appear sometimes conservative. They didn't want to do away with the noble order altogether. Rousseau was perhaps the most vocal in terms of this return to nature, or returning to the spiritual side of man. So in that sense, they were not for some kind of radicalized movement, but that because of their writing, the revolution found its basis, or its essential a narrative, if we could call it, like all movements do.
You use the word authenticate.
Right.
You know, that they are authenticating the pains and sufferings as well as the ideas
right.
of the village.
Yes. That is true.
They are making it respectable.
They are making it respectable by the written word.
By the written word. Yes.
Also making it not just respectable, but making it a reality, which so for people to believe that yes, it is happening, and the way they structure it is also reflective of how they look at this entire
You also
system.
use the word conservative here.
Yes.
So where
not exactly conservative, I would say. What I meant was that in some cases, they like Voltaire talked about tolerance of all religion, talked about tolerance of and more secular kind of life, but he did not think of ousting the nobility. Say
that is conservative.
That is, yeah. So that streak, because he's not a revolutionary writer, but he is a genuine writer who's voicing the concerns of people and believes in a kind of humanism.
And even Rousseau, talks of going back to nature. So
Right.
not going forward to any kind of
No, but you see what Rousseau suggests. So when we look at the 18th century in terms of the intellectual background of 18th century, or if we could say that the thought of the period, then the first 30 or 40 years of the 18th century was based on the idea of Descartes, and believed in the Cartesian logic of deductive logic, where you could you reasoned based on based on what was already available, and then reached conclusions.
You have wisdom, you have ideas, and then you prove them.
Right.
That is
yes.
logic.
And then later, and this was followed by then the experimental scientific logic, which believed in the inductive logic, that we need to start from experience and observation, and then reach some kind of conclusive truth. So this way of reasoning also came to the fore. But by the time we reach Rousseau suggests that actually both kind of logics are not competent enough to give us an understanding of human life, because we need to move towards intuition and instinct, and to the spiritual fiber of human life.
Which is again, turning something which
and
is
that
real.
is available closer to nature.
Yeah,
You see
yes.
instinct, and that is where you see the root of also romanticism coming into being. The root of romanticism here is where it is, that logic as such, rationality as such cannot provide us the truth, and both these kind of ways of reasoning or the law is incomplete without its instinct.
So what will give the answer to the problem? If logic cannot give, what will give the answer to
Yes,
the
so
problem?
no, what Rousseau says is that they are inadequate. He says that you cannot base your understanding only on the basis of rationality or just thought. You need to integrate it with the feeling or the instinct, and therefore to make it more human. You see, it appears to me that what Rousseau is suggesting is that there is a law which can be interpreted in many ways, and but the spirit of law is more important. And actually this is what at one stage Voltaire said, that that the spirit of law is what I believe in and not the law. So the idea is that because spirit of law brings you closer to human life, and the law needs perhaps change, and one may not stick to that rational truth or the principle, and that principle may be molded to suit human life.
Ideas and actual experience, they have to get together.
So ideas without feeling, ideas without human sentiment or the human self, it would be incomplete for Rousseau.
So for Rousseau, it is important at that point of time to stress experience and stress humanity and nature.
Yes, because he's also talking about sentiment. And here, of course, when sentiment again brings you closer to suffering. So and not also, I think all this is largely it has to be kept in mind, because it was in that period where everything was in a state of complete crisis, where there were these erratic laws being made, and also people were guillotined, were killed on the order of the king. So there was some kind of rationality required to it, but a rationality which is human centered. So not policy centered, not principle centered, but a rationality which is human centered.
So rationality which is not mental, which is not bothered about the activity of the brain, but rationality which takes people to the heart of the problem and to the heart of the people.
Also, I think this also became a way Rousseau could become one with the folks of the village or folks who lived in the village, because they were closer to nature and therefore closer to instinct and in that sense sentiment, which in the process of civilization, as Rousseau says, we've become corrupt. And you see, Rousseau, talking in a biographical way, Rousseau had lived. He was working, and he ran from the apprenticeship that he was working, where he was working, and he ran and became a wanderer for a good a decade or two, and stayed with common people and lived his life there. And when he came back to test his worth as a poet, as a writer, he realized that that world was shallow. And therefore, he could find that that what was missing in the world of the court, and that's how he could devise a way of going. He found dignity in man who lived closer to nature, and therefore this kind of approach was then given this kind of precedence.
So the words that are emerging in your discourse are words of dignity, words of some kind of a sanctity, words of seriousness, words of serious engagement, words of feeling, experience. These are the words. So these are positive words. These are the key words of Rousseau and
yes.
thinkers of the this French Revolution, who catered to the requirements of the peasantry. So this finally emerges.
I think they were largely going by the ideals of reason, tolerance, humanity, and within this framework, they were rejecting everything that was exploitative, and rejecting everything that did not respect human life. So there was a more humanistic approach, which finally gave that kind of a framework to the French Revolution.
In a minute or two, what would you call the essence of the French Revolution then?
So you see, the problems of French Revolution, actually, I would say, is that the irony, the two things, that it fought against a centralized absolutism, and finally it became a kind of a government which was more centralized, and in that sense, the vision of that movement did not actually implement or did not see a kind of concretization or any kind of material. It did not materialize in that manner, because the peasants and the poor did not gain the rights that they had hoped for. So in that sense, it was the feudal order, feudalism, and now it is the order of the bourgeois, which had a national assembly in name, but actual reality did not change much of the French Revolution, because the peasants finally didn't gain anything out of it, the ones who fought for with their lives.
Is it taking then in the direction of disillusionment?
Yes, in that sense, because it is quite ironical. That's the paradox, I think, of the French Revolution, that it fought against absolutism, worked in the direction of democracy and a republic, but again became a kind of a centralized government, which was equally oppressive at the end.
Please give the concluding remarks.
I think in relation to the romantic literature that we are talking about, the romantic trend, the French Revolution ignited a kind of hope among the romantics, because that they had seen the revolution, they had heard about a revolution, that was the English Revolution, but here was a revolution which was being carved out after their heart, and the way people came out on the streets. So the romantics gained courage and inspiration from this kind of a movement where things could change, and they were changing every day before their eyes. So in that sense, it brought in hope in the English for the English romantics.
Imagine all the battle is being fought in France, and the hope is coming somewhere near England.
Right.
English romanticism is being strengthened by the experience of the French Revolution.
Yes, and in that sense also they take a lot from Rousseau, and Rousseau's idea of sentiment and imagination and intuition, and the human element is strengthened in romantic literature as well because of this.
So viewers, the discussion that we had, and where Dr. Richa Bajaj was talking about different aspects of French Revolution, what emerges finally is that there was a kind of a movement going on, and it had its roots in the pains and sufferings of the French peasantry, and because of which it could not find any answers directly speaking. And later on, a kind of disillusionment occurred. But then, so far as English romanticism is concerned, English romantic trend is concerned, there, humanism became clear, much more well defined than elsewhere, and this strengthened the romantic trend in English. So that's the point that we finally emerge, finally emerge in this. And I think that this is an important insight into what was seen in the name of English romanticism at that time. With this, we come to the end of the discussion, and thank you, Dr. Richa Bajaj, for giving this insightful lecture.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.